more to come in, but let's see how we go in the next minute or so. Michael, good day.
Hello, John. Good to see you. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good to see you.
Hi, John. How are you? And Michael, how are you?
Hey, Gary. Good to see you too.
All right. Well, we might get underway.
The schooner's only water, John. It's only water.
Yeah.
I dream of the day it's got a frothy top on it and I can get into the pub.
Exactly. May it be sooner than later.
Correct.
All right. We might get underway. Do we want to do some sort of housekeeping announcements, Vanessa?
Thank you. If anybody would like to ask a question, please use the message chat box and I'll relay them to John, and we might have some polls during the session as well, which we'd appreciate everybody's input. But otherwise, have fun and enjoy the recovery, the pathway to the recovery.
Fantastic. Thanks, Vanessa. And as you saw, we are recording the session, so please bear with us from that perspective. All right, we're going to get underway, and I'm going to take us through a range of different things this afternoon. I'm going to start with the national plan and calibrate our discussions around the phasing in the national plan. Then have a bit of a look at where the vaccination rollout is at, and the point of that is to try and come up with some dates that we can use to pin down where we think the reopening is going to take us. And then I'm going to have a look at the 4 work streams that we've got going on to guide us through the recovery. So I'm going to now share a few things on the screen. Okay, I don't know quite what it's doing there. Anyway, photos, there we go. All right, so let's put them up in this order. Okay, so firstly, let's have a look at the national plan. So as we know, this is put out by National Cabinet. At the current point, I think we've only had one of the First Ministers that's walked away from the plan. The others are still hanging in there with various levels of commitment. It's essentially the phasing of the plan takes us from phase A, which is now, and that basically is described as the vaccinate, prepare and pilot phase. Very importantly, that last word, that it is involving a range of pilots. Once we get to 70% double dose vaccination for everyone 16 years and over, we'll move to phase B, and that phase B involves some opening up. I'll take us through what that looks like. Phase C, we enter into once we're at double dose 80%. And then phase D, there's no prescribed vaccination rollout proportion there, but it does describe that phase D as the point at which we can manage COVID-19 just as we would any other infectious disease. So that's the phasing that the National Cabinet's agreed on. There is a whole range of different tourism themes that run through each of those phases. So, for example, in terms of arrival caps, which we know is going to control how many people can come to the country from an international tourism perspective, phase A, where we are now, is about inbound passenger caps being reduced. And we know when the national roadmap was agreed to, it was on the basis of reducing caps of arrivals. Phase B is when the arrival caps go back up their pre-Delta lockdown number. And we also will have larger caps for returning travellers. So basically they're saying once we get to that 70% double dose, we'll be able to go back to the previous caps. Phase C, it's abolishing all caps on returning vaccinated Australians. So you can see there that there's a phasing in of the arrival caps that's mentioned in those dot points in the national plan. There's also a phasing that occurs across a range of other things. So international travel quarantine, for example, starts out with this phase we're in now, trialling and piloting the introduction of alternative quarantine options. Phase B, introduce new reduced quarantine arrangements for vaccinated residents. So that's saying if you're coming back into Australia and you're already vaccinated, you'll have a reduced quarantine period by the time we get to that 70% mark. Phase C, extend quarantine-free travel bubbles to Singapore and the Pacific, if not others, and a gradual reopening of inward and outbound international travel. And then once we get to phase D, we look at a quarantine environment where it only applies to high-risk travel. So that's kind of the way that the phasing works for those two areas. There's also a phasing for border restrictions, which essentially has the border pretty much closed until we get to 80%, that phase C, at which time all restrictions on outbound travel are lifted. So each of the areas, we've got this phasing across each of the stages of the national plan that tells us when various parts of tourism are going to be reactivated. I just want to go to the final one that I'll mention, which is cohorts. That is, there's a range of different cohorts that are called out in the plan. So in phase A, where we are now, the plan says that we'll expand commercial trials for limited entry of students and economic visa holders. Once we get to phase B, there'll be capped entry for those categories. And phase C, increased capped entry for student, economic and humanitarian visa holders. So there's this gradual building, particularly of those cohorts that include international students, and we would say should include also working holiday makers. So the plan is quite clear as to what happens at which stage. And what we've done is taken that plan and built that out into what we need to do in a tourism and hospitality sense, which I'll start to unpack in a moment. Before I do that, though, what I'd like to do is just take us to this graph that comes from The Guardian, which basically tells us when we're going to hit those points. So the first of the points is when we get to that 70% double dose. Their estimation is that that'll happen on the 30th of October. And then by the time we get to the 16th of November, we'll be at that 80% double dose. So essentially, if you think about that phasing, we're going to hit these milestones pretty soon. The way that the plan is actually mapped out, you'll see that in the plan, it says that the phase will commence once we have a national average of that number, or we reach the 70% double dose number nationally, but then states will come into the plan as they hit that number as well. So at this stage, the first jurisdiction over the line is going to be the ACT, and they, for instance, reached the 70% double dose mark on the 13th of October. So we've got this sort of gradual joining of the states into the next phase as it comes along. So that's more or less the way it should roll out. The agreement from the National Cabinet is that each of the jurisdictions will not impose any more restrictions than are detailed in the plan, but they can impose less. So it's then up to the states to arrive at what mark they think works for them. Okay, so what does that mean for us? So what I've put here in this graphic is firstly that phasing that we have across the top, the phase A, the phase B, phase C, and phase D. Now, when we're looking at those phases, Phase A we know is now. Phase B, we're looking at around about the October mark, which is when we get to that 70% double dose. Phase C, we're looking at the beginning of December. So end of November, beginning of December for phase C. And phase D, we estimate that that's going to happen somewhere around the March, April period. So by the time we get to that sort of March, April time, we should be in a position to be treating COVID pretty much as we would any other infectious disease. So that's what those sort of phases we think looks like in terms of dates. So in order to manage this process from a tourism-wide perspective, we've developed these 4 work streams that you see moving down the page. The first of those is to support the promotion of vaccination. And you all, I hope, would have seen It's Our Best Shot for Travel work that Tourism Australia has done. They've also done It's Our Best Shot for Events, and even It's Our Best Shot for Hospitality, to bring in all of the sectors. The best sort of reaction has been from the It's Our Best Shot for Travel, essentially because it's about what consumers want to do. And we're finding that It's Our Best Shot for Travel resonates a lot with consumers and is part of them wanting to get back to normal. You're seeing that sort of attitude coming through some of the other promotional efforts, including the New South Wales advertising campaign that's talking about getting back to doing all the wonderful things that we used to do. That phase 1, though, the first work stream, is really not only, though, about this sort of promotional effort, it's also about all of the other things that we can do to promote vaccination, not the least of which is getting business involved in the vaccination rollout. And we had a very important change on that front only over last weekend, which was the point at which the government agreed to indemnify businesses that were rolling out their own vaccination program within their business. And that was a very important step because business was not engaging with their own vaccination rollouts for fear of being held liable for any of the downsides of the vaccination program. So all of that effort, we've got quite a significant group of actions in that first work stream that particularly the Australian Chamber is working on pretty hard to make sure that we keep the momentum up on the rate of vaccination. If you just think about what I've put there in terms of the timeline, we're certainly suggesting that the promotional effort needs to roll through until we're at that double dose 80% mark. And in reality, probably longer than that. One of the challenges most countries have had is that sort of last 9-yard type effort where you get to the 70% double dose, but trying to get that extra 10% has really taken a lot of time in some jurisdictions. Others have found it a lot easier, like Singapore, for example. But I think we'll find once we get to that 70+%, we've got to work really hard to get over the line for that final 10% to get us to that phase C level. So that's the first work stream, making sure we keep the momentum up behind the vaccination rates. The second work stream is about keeping business in business. It's about making sure that the support mechanisms exist to keep businesses alive whilst we wait for the recovery to roll out. Importantly, we've made sure that that effort is not something we stop as soon as we get some of these lockdowns eased. We need support to continue way past that amount of time and way past the areas of the country that are actually in lockdown. It's certainly the case that areas of our country that aren't necessarily in lockdown are really suffering from having New South Wales in lockdown, Victoria in lockdown, Canberra in lockdown, and some of our destinations, particularly in the northern part of the country, just don't have any markets left to draw on. So they need to make sure they can get support at the same time. Some of the actions I've built in here, making sure that the job saver type schemes extend past the hotspot designation, as I've mentioned. We also need to make sure that those schemes are reaching the businesses that need them. There are a range of limitations to the rollout. We've just seen increases to the thresholds in New South Wales and the ACT. We need to see also organisations that have revenues drawn from offshore, which are currently counted into the threshold. We need to have them able to access support as well. Some of the programs that will need to continue through until international restart commences are things like the Zoos and Aquariums program, the travel agents and tour operators schemes, and also the business events grant schemes. I have to say that business events is such an important part of our restart process that we need to make sure that our operators in that space are still around so that we can really accelerate the road out. The other area in that work stream that's important is to look at the small to medium business loan program. We had discussions with Treasury over the week before last, and we saw some changes to that program recently to make it a bit easier, but we're still having a lot of tourism and hospitality businesses that the banks won't loan to, even though we've got an 80% guarantee from the government on those loans. So all of that activity needs to go on to make sure that by the time we get to the recovery point, we've got the businesses in place to get that rebound that we need. Next, we have Workstream 3, which I've described here as preparing for the strongest, fastest recovery possible. There's really only one thing that's going to save our businesses in the tourism and hospitality space, and that is to get the recovery happening and to get people travelling again. And we need to make sure that that is the strongest, fastest recovery that we can possibly manage. And to be frank, we're not going to make that happen unless we start now with some very significant planning to make sure that we can get the domestic rebound sitting in that post-December mark. I've put it in there at the phase C point, which is when it's in the roadmap. We have to make sure that once we hit December, we can take off like a rocket once we can get that domestic travel restart happening. Remembering that at the same time as we get that domestic uplift, we'll also be having those expanded travel bubbles. We'll be back into New Zealand. We most likely will have a travel bubble with Singapore and work going on to get the Pacific and also consideration of the US and the UK into a travel bubble that will happen in that phase C type timing. It's not until when we get to phase D in March or April that we get a much more open border arrangement. But before we get to that point, we will have these additional bubbles, and they're going to take quite some organising to make them work. I don't know how many of you were part of the New Zealand bubble when it was open for that month or so recently, but it was a very clunky travel experience, I have to say, and filling out the number of forms and going onto various websites and filling travel authorities out. It was a really difficult process, and we need to make sure that once we get to that rebound in those bubbles in December, and when we get the more open international border in March, April, that the experience is much more streamlined than it was during that bubble. So this brings me to all of the items that I've got there under that Workstream 3 to try and prepare us for where we go next. So the first is really just to keep up this advocacy effort on treating vaccinated people differently to unvaccinated people. Back in June, when we started to have lockdowns being announced, we wrote through the chamber to chief health officers and to first ministers to ask them to make sure that their recovery plan involved distinguishing vaccinated from unvaccinated people. This is not only important from the perspective of giving those that are vaccinated a reason to have their vaccination, to get their second shot and to be part of the program, but it's also making sure that whatever the recovery plan is, it's very much latched to risk. It should be about where the risk exists, and you can't argue that there is not a different risk level between vaccinated and unvaccinated people. So we need to keep talking that up. I think you've seen not only through the plan, but in all the discussion over the last days, a lot of focus on what the vaccinated versus unvaccinated rollout looks like. And we've started to see announcements in both New South Wales and Victoria of different things that are going to be opened up even in the next weeks to those that are vaccinated. So greater groups of people being able to congregate outdoors, releasing of some of those restrictions, particularly in outdoor areas, but only for people that are vaccinated. And that sort of differentiation needs to be built in, not only at our domestic level, like we're seeing at the moment, but also internationally. So when we bring Australians back in that have left the country, if they're vaccinated, the situation in relation to quarantine should be different to those that are not vaccinated. If we then go to the pilot and trial aspect here, I think the stage that we're at the moment in this phase A, we have to be able to use these pilots to make sure that systems work. If you remember back when we first announced the bubble with New Zealand, we had all of these issues with the first groups that arrived that landed and then started to disperse around the country, and other jurisdictions weren't ready for that. These are the sort of things that we need to pilot and trial while we're in this pilot phase to make sure they work. Working holiday maker groups coming in, student groups coming in, Pacific workers coming in, and making sure that we get our systems right for not only processing visas, but also all of the other things that we need to do to get the international market working again. And there's also things that we've got to get back up and running from a domestic perspective as well. I'm sure most of you would have had some domestic travel in that sort of March to June period. And whilst it wasn't quite as clunky as it was internationally, there was some huge delays airside in airports, and lots of different paperwork to complete and authorities to complete. These things we've got to make sure we're getting up and running early, starting now, because we've only got a couple of months to get these things right, so that when we get again, once we get to that December period and we get domestic taking off again, let's make sure it's as strong and as fast a recovery as we can possibly make it. Re-establishing links and markets is also really important. If we get to the period where we're starting to think about some of the quarantine-free bubble arrangements, we've got to re-establish links with all of those groups that are going to provide inbound traffic coming into Australia. And whilst the focus initially will be on Australians leaving and coming back, we also have to work with some of those other markets, like the work that we're doing at the moment with working holiday maker groups, to ensure that we've still got working holiday makers wanting to come to Australia. I think in their heart of hearts, they're desperate to come here, but we've got to make sure that we've got agents and those people in market that are still linked to the travellers that are likely to come to Australia. Rebuilding domestic, I touched on that a minute ago, but We really need to have product out there in the market. I've put the holiday here this year logo up there, but we really need to make sure that that promotional effort is focused where we really need the uplift. The danger we're going to have with a December timeframe is that we're going to get leisure travel coming back first. We're not going to have a lot of business travel at that time of year, and we're also going to really struggle with getting our cities activated as soon as we get to that December period. So we're going to have a lot of promotion around our cities to get people holidaying in our cities, making sure that there's leisure activations in our cities. They need to be planned out now so that we can get people moving, people staying in our cities once we get to that traditional December, January holiday period. Interoperability of international systems. There's a lot of work going on in this space at the moment. The generation of vaccination certificates that are going to be applicable in a domestic sense, but also applicable internationally. And I understand that we're going to have the launch of the ICAO, the International Council of Airline Operations system that will give us our international interface sometime in October. And that system needs to work with the systems from other countries. And at this stage, we haven't seen that. We've done work with the OECD on a framework to get recognition, but we haven't seen the other end of that yet. The use of technology is going to be really important, not only in relation to vaccination certificates, but it's going to be very important in terms of people movement. Even domestically through airports, for example, we've got to make sure that we use technology to be able to move people more efficiently. This situation that we had back in March, April, where you'd walk off a plane and queue up and fill out a paper form that was looked at by somebody who might have taken your temperature and tried to assess whether they wanted you in their state or not, really isn't an appropriate way to be managing people movement in this day and age. Similarly, we need to have contactless people movement through our ports and making sure that all of the work that was done pre-pandemic to get this sort of using biometrics to identify people rather than them having to throw pieces of paper around and be scanning passports through scanners. We've got to make that experience a hell of a lot better, not only to make it more attractive to the visitor, but to make sure that it's a more COVID safe experience as well. Finally, I think in that third work stream, building back events is just so important. And those events are going to need to be planned out now, and it's almost too late for events that will happen for us in December once we get that domestic movement back. We've got to make sure that those events can rebound and be there to get that rebound happening for everybody else, because events is what drives significant visitation, and we've got to make sure that those events can attract the levels of traffic through our interstate borders as we can possibly get. I had a discussion over the weekend with Cricket Australia about the first Ashes test that's happening in December in Brisbane. Those sort of events also need to really be supported so we can get that strongest, fastest recovery possible. Finally, I wanted to go to the fourth work stream, and we will keep some time for questions after I do this. This is kind of about making sure that we've also got an eye on the future. There's a piece of work going on at the moment that's being led by Martin Ferguson as the chair of the Reimagining the Visitor Economy expert panel. This is about what happens between now and 2030, how we rebuild our industry back better, or building back best, or whatever phrase you want to use. It's about framing up the future in a way that makes us more resilient, makes us a better industry and a more attractive destination to international travellers, and a more seamless destination from a domestic travel point of view. All of these things are being considered as part of that work at the moment. There's been a lot of consultation, a lot of discussion about this strategy. We really need to make sure that we keep one eye on that future piece. We all know that everyone's in a world of pain at the moment, but it won't take long for us to get to the recovery. And then from there, we've got to make sure we rebuild in a way that will really stand us up for the next 10 years of activity through our visitor economy. So each of those 4 work streams, we're pushing pretty hard. There's a lot of skills focus to every one of those activities, particularly in the short-term rebuild. We've got to make sure that we have the skilled people to be able to do the jobs that we're going to need for that recovery that's happening very soon, let alone the international recovery. And we need to make sure we bring back some of those overseas workers to make that recovery happen. So I'll leave it at that for my outline. We might go to some questions now and see what those of you around the Zoom are interested in. So let's see what we've got in the chat to start with.
So there's one there from Philip that said some would argue against different rules for the vaccinated. I don't disagree, but some politicians might.
Yeah, look, I mean, there is always this debate around, whether that's a valid way to go. Obviously, those that are not keen on vaccinations are arguing against having that differentiation. The bottom line, though, is if you look at the risk and you look at operating venues and operating events and the like, it's a very different risk profile if you have vaccinated people in your venue to if you have unvaccinated people. And we know now from all the data that there is a significant impact on transmissibility. We know there's a significant impact on the way this virus is transmitted, even with the Delta strain. There's a significant difference between the two categories, the vaccinated and unvaccinated. So I really think we need to focus on getting an opportunity for venues to reopen, for business to get back to business in that lower risk environment. If we don't do that, it's going to take us so much longer to get a restart happening.
And Gary Stokes asked, do we know where the working holiday market is exactly?
Well, it's interesting. We've got a pilot that we're working on now to bring working holiday makers out of the UK and Ireland particularly. We know that they're obviously very strong markets for working holiday makers. We also have had some interest from Germany to bring the German working holiday makers back, also a very strong market. So there's a lot of interest. There is also, a preparedness to do some level of quarantine if we can get those working holiday makers back into the country. We're working on it now because we know that if we leave it much longer, we're not going to have the workforce that we need to get the domestic recovery happening, let alone the international recovery. So it's really about working with the market and making sure we can bring those backpackers, the working holiday makers, back into the country.
And then we had another question from iPad. So I'm not too sure who that person is. If outdoor events are to open in December, will we have phased approach or limited numbers, such as 1 per 4 square meters?
Yeah, look, I don't think there's any doubt that there'll be capacity limits, and we know how painful they are. So I think we will have limitations based on those density limits. Only today we had the Treasurer talking about recovery. He said that there's no doubt that we will have those sort of 1 per 4 square metre type density rules applying. What we're working with the government on, though, is to try and unpack which of those restrictions really works from a health point of view. My view is we've sort of held on to what we knew about the virus 18 months ago, and we've still got COVID safe plans based on things that we now know don't make any difference. I mean, salt and pepper shakers on tables outdoors really doesn't represent a significant risk, nor do menus that you can't wipe down. There's nothing that suggests that anyone has caught COVID from a surface outdoors in that sort of way. So we just need to make sure that the restrictions that we have in that reopening phase are ones that are real, and that we don't apply restrictions where they're not achieving a risk mitigation to the transmission of the virus. But one that I think we will have to live with are these sort of density restrictions. And I have no doubt that the 1 per 4 square metre rule will be part of that first break of restrictions in December.
Our next question was from Amanda Fuller. What date do you predict restaurants will reopen that do not have outdoor dining, and under what initial restrictions, considering last year we reopened with only 10 guests per sitting?
Yeah, look, I don't think there's any doubt now that we will see a difference between indoor and outdoor. The risk profile is very different. I think we will also see a differential between vaccinated and unvaccinated. If you look at what's happening elsewhere around the world, we've got countries where there are no restrictions on who can dine outdoors, but indoors you need to be vaccinated. So, you know, what the timing will be on that, look, I think by the time we get to that 80% double dose, by the time we get to that December period, we're going to have some dining indoors. My best guess would be that we'll probably have a 1 per 4 square metres to start with, and perhaps that will be indoors, vaccinated only. That, I think, well, our view from the Australian Chamber Tourism's point of view is that there shouldn't be a mandate for businesses to have to only accept vaccinated people, but I'm sure some businesses will. If it means they can reopen indoors, if it means they can operate their business, they will most likely say, well, we'll go with the vaccinated mob to start with.
Thank you. And Sandy Tomiden, how does the international business event market perceive Australia?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And I think the question can go probably not just to events, but what the current perception of offshore markets is in general. I mean, we're still writing events through the business events bid fund. I understand that there's still been very significant interest in that fund. So there's still interest offshore in coming to Australia for events. The interest is still getting to the level where, you know, we've got bids that we're supporting. The challenge is that if we go on much past the end of the year, we'll fall out of another cycle of those international events. So really important for us to be in there with the bid fund, to be in there supporting those events and building the reputation that we have as an event destination. We've got a good reputation generally. Most of the media has said how well we've dealt with the pandemic. we've got to capitalise on that reputation as a safe country, as a country that's managed the pandemic well, and use that reputation to build visitation internationally for business events, but also for a whole range of other elements of the visitor economy.
Phil Xavier, what is your take on education and training sector of the industry?
Well, I mean, I think as part of the sort of longer term piece, there's been a lot of discussion on the education and training part of tourism and hospitality and the reputation that we have internationally. We've certainly been pushing the view that we should establish an international reputation for training in tourism and hospitality in Australia. We do it really well, and we should capitalise on that. And it should be explicit in our international ed strategy that is one of the things we're good at and we have a competitive advantage for. It's going to take us a while to get there, though. You know, we need to really capitalise on this next year's recruitment period for international education to try and rebuild that market. The domestic market has been pretty hot and cold. And usually when we get to a very constrained labour market like we have at the moment, we get less people enrolling in domestic quals in our industry. So I think we've got some way to go before we build back the domestic market. And the international market, we're going to have to crack really hard from our tourism and hospitality perspective to make sure that we really get a bounce out of our reputation for doing so well in that area.
Deepak Rayo has asked a question. What is your guidance on mandating staff vaccinations or your belief?
Yeah. So this is a really tricky area. I'd suggest if you look at the resources that are available through ACCI, through the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry on vaccinations, there's a very large resource there on how to unpack all of the issues, really going down the path of mandatory vaccination. It depends on whether that is required in order to create a safe workplace. And that resource that I've referred to will really unpack that for you. It's a very complex area and one that we haven't got enough time to treat in any sort of level of detail. So I'd really suggest having a look at that resource.
That's all the questions that we have so far, unless somebody may have another one.
Yeah, I think we might have cleared the questions, Vanessa, and that sort of brings us to, yeah, and we're kind of right on time, aren't we?
We are. I just thought it might be worth mentioning our next webinar on the 15th as well, John.
Yeah, that would be great, Vanessa. I'll just do a quick ad for that. So we do have a webinar coming up on the 15th. It's in relation to international education and it's with Study New South Wales. It's about the strategy to get international students back into New South Wales and what that looks like. Obviously, a lot of work going on in that space right now, and we want to bring the Study New South Wales team to you to outline where the opportunities might be in that restart. So please join us for that, and thanks for Zooming in today.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, good night.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Vanessa.
Thanks.
Thank you, John.
Thanks all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. Actually, could I ask a very quick question before we go? I took a screenshot of that slide. Is it okay if I use that?
Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you.
No
Just,
problem.
I took a screenshot of it, but I thought, ooh, I better ask.
No, it's all good.
Thank you.
No
Okay,
problem.
good on you.
Thanks. Okay, and then there were 10.
All right, well.
All good.
You okay?
Thanks, guys. Thank you.
All right, thank you, bye.
Thanks.
Ciao.
Bye-bye. Good.